I'd like to thank my colleagues for these very, very interesting remarks. We're going to have a little free-flowing discussion here for about 20 minutes and then open it up to questions from all of you. I'm the moderator nominally, but I'd like to just let you guys react to things that each of us has said. Let me start with a question, I guess, for Dr. Blair and Dr. Alia Klein. Each of you, a reasonable interpretation of some of the things you've said is that maybe there are ways of classifying violence into different types of violence. And one classification based on causal factors could be instrumental violence versus reactive violence. And I'd like to ask each of you, what would you think about a case where someone has a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, commits a violent act that is apparently deliberative and planned, and from that person's delusional perspective, may be done for a purpose. At the same time, they're reacting to internal stimuli and perhaps driven by delusions and hallucinations. How do we think about, and maybe they're angry at the same time based on the fact that their delusions tell them that someone is trying to harm them. And I'd like to ask each of you how you think about a case like that in terms of classifying that violent behavior, and why is it useful to do so?
What if I go off? So, yeah, I certainly do think that this is really critical, this distinction between instrumental, as I was mostly outlining, and the reactive, which is more appropriate for the emotional labile group. The case that you were describing, the type of case that you were describing, there it becomes very interesting, because in fact, in some respects, in certain situations, we're not just instrumental or reactive when we're trying to classify an event. And in fact, actually, one of the dominant behavioral models of reactive aggression is a task called the point subtraction task. And basically what happens is you're playing a game with somebody else and they mess you about and they take points away from you, and then you can respond by, in one version, electric shocks, or one version, taking money away from them. That's, in some respects, that's, in reactive, you're angry about the person's doing it, you're being socially provoked. And in the other case, it's clearly instrumental. You're choosing to do something in retaliation to the person. So very like your example. And what it looks like here is we do have this combination. You're getting the goal is being generated by the rage response for the provocation. But at the same time, the architecture that's necessary to implement a behavioral choice is these reasons like ventral medial prefrontal cortex and some of these learning mechanisms, the amygdala's role in anticipating the distress of the victim potentially. And so my guess would be in that case, although we don't have the data, that what we're looking at is an individual indeed whose part of his condition has generated this extreme level of provocation, but he's not modulating, especially if he's committing extremely unpleasant acts, not modulating his behavior appropriately because of additional problems in this ventral medial prefrontal cortex with respect to decision making.
Yes, I agree. I think that also going back to traits and to personality, it only goes so far, and then you need to further characterize the violent behavior. So it might be instrumental, it might be reactive, but these are just words. And really, it depends, for example, in a criminal justice type of case, it depends on the individual, not on what we find in some group studies. It really depends on that particular individual, that person with a brain tumor, and how it affects their behavior, and how brain tumors can change personality. So someone who their whole life had enduring patterns of behavior that had nothing to do with anger or aggression, and then they develop this tumor, and that tumor is in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and suddenly their personality is changing, and the pattern of their behaviors start to change. So all of that has to be taken into account in the criminal justice system, and I feel bad for them. It's a daunting task.
Professor Jones, is it a relevant distinction, do you think, in criminal justice?
So it's interesting, right? So the legal system's approach to classification is different. It has its own goal in parallel to what's going on in science. Its first classification challenge is this person going to be held responsible for the behavior, or are they not? I mean, it's really black and white. Either they're going to be locked up in prison, or perhaps in a mental health institution, or they're not going to be held at all. And then, and only then, when we get to the question of how we might sentence them, does the variation in responsibility arguably come into play when we think about what would be a just way of sentencing them. Now, keep in mind that a just way is not completely identical to a fair way, right? So a fair way would be focused just on fairness to this individual, whereas the justice system is charged with a broader mission, and that is to do justice across society. And so, for example, there may be deterrence functions here that we need to think about. Maybe this person is undeterrable, but other people who might behave similarly might be deterred by a prison sentence of a particular time. So at that point, all the evidence can come in about how evidence of psychopathy, evidence of how other people in the community might attest to the beneficent acts of this individual as well. This gets weighed in trying to figure out for how long we might put this person away.
Our group did this study some years ago where we analyzed violent behavior in a group of patients with schizophrenia. And we found there was a subgroup of individuals who had a history of early life antisocial behavior that would have predated the onset of their adult psychotic illness. And not only were they much more likely to be violent, but the correlates and the putative causes of violence in that group were also different. It wasn't necessarily related to acute psychosis. And even when those individuals were compliant with antipsychotic medication, it did not reduce their violence risk, unlike their counterparts. When you think about that and the kind of trade-off between sort of the way people are and kind of their illness that is something they have, how do we think about the trade-off, say, between what you call culpability and maybe the public safety goal of saying, well, we should just, have more surveillance and more control over that person, even if it's not necessarily their fault, because maybe these risk factors were things that developed in childhood and relate to their genetic heritability and so on. How do you trade that off between the individual's right and the public safety concerns? And what could science help us with that?
Well, it used to be that scientists would work alone. So there would be one scientist and everything will be named on him and he would be in charge of this lab and that's it. Now scientists are learning to work together more and more. And I think that's a similar analogy in terms of the systems of government we have. So you have the criminal justice system, you have the healthcare system, and all of these systems are really in charge of making our lives better. Or maybe I'm too naive, but that's really the stated goal generally. And so everything depends on collaboration and communication. So increasing communication between the healthcare system and the justice system can help track individuals, keep them safe from society, but also perhaps provide treatment, especially in a younger age where you can really change the trajectory of the development of personality.
So to your question of how you strike that balance, the answer is not well, but the best you can. And the reason is because it's society, not science, that's going to tell people, tell the justice system how to strike that balance. Right? It's a terrible task, judges tell me, trying to decide how to treat a real live human being who's in front of them. And that requires balancing these completely incommensurate things, society and individual, that somehow they're supposed to take care of at the same time. But science isn't going to solve that problem. All it is going to add some additional evidence to be weighed in the balance alongside everything else that the judge is trying to weigh.
Yeah, I just...
The complexity.
Yeah, but just to follow up, I would say really they got, at least as I see my goal in science, is by identifying the actual problems that we're seeing, we can then devise treatments that are much more likely to address those problems. And so I don't go anywhere near the justice system, but the fact is that as we're getting to that situation of really being able to have treatments that will be working with these various disparate populations that increase the risk for different forms of aggression, we should be able to, we can sort of slightly bypass the issue because the science is addressing the conditions.
Let me ask a question about firearms violence for a second and what science would say to policymakers. If we were to build a monument to commemorate all the people who died as a result of a gunshot in the last 10 years. We'd need one 5 times larger than the Vietnam Memorial. I've calculated if we were to back out the risk basically related to mental illness, that might be reduced by, by a third. But about 95% of that would be from reducing suicides, not homicides. The restrictions that we have on firearms access for people with mental illness have been criticized of late as being both over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. A history of involuntary commitment may scoop up lots of people who aren't dangerous, and it misses some people, maybe in a first episode of psychosis, who are violent. If the policymakers were to come in and say, well, we aren't going to limit access to firearms broadly in this country. We have the Second Amendment and the Heller and the McDonald's decisions, but what we do want to do is we want better criteria that will actually help us identify people who are dangerous, to protect themselves and others from them. What should we do to do that? And is there anything that science could say, just as a hypothetical, as a thought experiment, that would help us do a better job of limiting access to firearms for people who are likely to harm themselves or others?
Well, I like to start with education, because I do think that proper education can help people deal with risky things. So it reminds me of sexual education. Yes, we can tell young people to be abstinent or not to engage in sexual activity, but we could also give them the tools to understand and to educate themselves about the risk behavior. So that's one very important element, I think. And it also feeds into the analogy of the driving. How did we invest in less risky driving? By teaching and educating people to use their seatbelts, to drive more safely in different ways.
I agree. That sounds quite sensible. I have friends who own guns, and proudly, and I think responsibly. And I also have a friend who recently committed suicide with a firearm that he got that afternoon from a gunshot. So I don't think science is really going to solve the problem, although I think it can help to inform the debate. I really think it's a matter of political will and recognizing that rights don't come unfettered. Right? So you have a First Amendment right to free speech, but that doesn't protect you from liability if, for fun, you yell fire in a crowded auditorium and people are therefore injured. And along the lines of what you were saying, you can still have a right to guns if that's what the bulk of society believes it wants to maintain under the constitutional provisions it invokes, but you can still layer that right with lots of licensure or education or time delays between applying for a gun and actually getting it, which at least in the cases of a lot of suicides might help considerably, and maybe even in the context of homicides as well.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank my colleagues for these very thoughtful remarks, and we're going to open this up now and let all of you pose questions or make comments on this topic. And so I think you can approach the microphones, and if anyone has a question, please do that. And I'd just like to ask you, if you can, to try to make your questions and comments brief so that we can have more people participate. Why don't we start over on this side? Yes, sir.
Hi, David Spiegel. Thank you for a very interesting panel. It seems to me part of the problem in identifying brain problems, either hypoactive medial prefrontal cortex, hypo or hyperactive amygdala, is that we don't pay enough attention to what the majority of the brain, the rest of the brain, is doing or can do. And it seems to me part of the challenge in making sense of what we are discovering about neurofunctional problems related to violence is that we're not computing as well what the rest of the brain can do given the dysfunction that you've identified.
Thank you for that comment. Would one of the two of you are neuroscientists you'd like to?
Yeah, I think that, I obviously only showed you, just for example, that tiny little spot of the amygdala. The fact is, though, we do know how that architecture works. We know the way that the visual cortex is processing the stimulus, the information is going through temporal cortex, getting down to the amygdala. The amygdala is then, through interactions with temporal cortex, giving rise to the types of learning that's so critical for appropriate socialization that's failing in this case. case, and we know how the amygdala is sending forward expectancy information to ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So I mean, I think actually, and we also know that there's no clear evidence. I mean, there's lots of animal data showing the impact of damage to the amygdala on the types of emotional learning we see here, and there isn't compensation for this type of from other areas taking over. And so I mean, the trouble is when we're doing these sort of talks, they're very short, there are caricature positions. We're definitely not dealing with situations where models are based around individual brain areas. We're definitely, I mean, I sort of hinted at that at the end when I was talking about the interaction of caudate, ventromedial, and amygdala. It's obviously more complicated than that, but again, in these contexts. But as regards the compensation story, there's no evidence that we've got any so far that, for example, that role in stimulus reinforcement learning in the amygdala can be compensated for by other areas taking over.
Let's go to this side. Sir?
I'm Darrell Kirch from the Association of Medical Colleges, but before I took a violent turn and became a medical school dean, I actually spent quite a few years working in the neurobiology of schizophrenia. And I'd ask you how we deal with what I see as the other side of these spectacular and well-publicized acts of patients who are in psychotic states committing these violent acts, and the much higher prevalence of their being the victims of violence. You know, if those same aliens that you showed were looking at our shelters, our street corners, our city and county jails, they would see just how vulnerable these patients are. And what are your thoughts about how in our messaging we can not ignore the issues of violence in those patients, but also emphasize their true vulnerability?
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more, and that is a message that we need to emphasize. And even when, as I mentioned, people with schizophrenia may engage in violent behavior, even minor violent behavior, it may not. That might not be why. Many times these individuals also live in terrible neighborhoods, and they are exposed to all kinds of disadvantage. They're vulnerable not only because of their brain disorder and the impairments that implies, but also because we have a mental health care system, notwithstanding we know how to do things and we could do better outreach, that is fragmented and underfunded and overburdened and not very effective. And we need better treatments that would be more effective and more tolerable. We also need a service system that will try to overcome some of the barriers to care so that people with serious mental illness aren't just out there, vulnerable to victimization, and also unable to meet sometimes their basic needs for survival. So I think it's a message, but it's also a mandate for policy, even in this time when we would like to focus on better brain research. That's one side of it. But even if you have tomorrow the brand new magical molecule to cure schizophrenia, if you can't deliver it to people who need it because they're addicted or they're homeless or they don't believe they're mentally ill or they're in jail, then that's not going to solve our problem. And I think victimization is one very important part of that whole picture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over here, yes.
So that was a wonderful panel, and Owen, I hope you bottle that, and that should be almost a verbal textbook introduction to a lot of our friends in neuroscience and the law who are either too enthusiastic or too negative. But it's also a place to take off for questions for our other speakers. So I'll try to make this brief, but I wonder how many of you saw the cover of The Economist as you were getting on the plane, which was about failures of replicability in science, and it's really both a true problem and very unfortunate to see it on the cover of a magazine like that. But something I've been obsessed by since I was NIMH director, which is that lots of results either don't replicate or don't have external validity. That is, they don't generalize outside the confines of the lab. And in a group like this, nobody is satisfied when we apply the results of a phase 3 RCT, because everybody wants to see in a sophisticated way how treatments work in real-world populations with very large numbers. Now, if we go to the kinds of very compelling neurobiological results in the laboratory, for example, that we heard either about instrumental or reactive violence, the truth is, given the cost and the complexity, the number of scans that have been done is very small. The circumstances under which they're conducted are highly controlled. And, you know, if you were, if this were the sort of the equivalent of getting a treatment approved, you know, the FDA wouldn't even talk to you. And yet, these kinds of results, as we know, are beginning to be very influential in courts. So is there a fix? I mean, and I would just add, one of the things that the cognitive neuroscientists remind us is that one of the cognitive distortions or problems of being human is that we can't think statistically. Not even statisticians intuit statistically. So we can't rely on people to compare the individual with these small studies. What might be the fix? How do we move forward in a way that incorporates new knowledge but is just?
I think diseases are at different stages of development in terms of research and advancement, you know, to the goal of the solution or the cure. And definitely, you know, neuroscience is developing to be more and more impactful. But as you grow and develop as a body, like neuroscience, for example, it's very important that the non-replication or the negative results are very, very important. Sometimes they're as important as the positive results, because you don't just need to know where to go, you also need to know where not to go, and where not to spend, you know, precious taxpayers' money. So I think that it's a stage of development of a science, of a particular science.
Can I just comment very briefly? I mean, I do actually think that one of the things so I think as regards the legal system, everything that you'd raise is a significant issue. It's sort of the problems that we were hearing about in the problems of the situation now. I think where it really gets exciting, I mean, the great thing now about the psychopathy research over this last 5-10 years is we have, you know, and it's not obviously just my lab, there's a whole bunch of different labs across the world replicating relatively tightly these findings, particularly with respect to the amygdala reduced response to distress cues, some of the more recent stuff with respect to the more general decision-making impairment. But that again, we're still back. We're still relatively, you know, if it's 100 people or now maybe a couple of hundred people, we're still basically, you know, trivial ends. Where I think really gets exciting, though, is because we have, and we also have loads of behavioral data is very tightly consistent with this as well, but where I think that gets exciting is it means that we have these biomarkers, and therefore we can evaluate current treatments and novel treatments far more effectively than we've ever been possible to do before. And that's where I think really the promise of neuroscience is with respect to helping these individuals. The legal system is another. That's your area.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind remarks, Steve. I appreciate it. With respect to how to fix this, I don't have the solution, but I have some thoughts that might help. One is the crosstalk between the science world and the legal world is important, and it's difficult, and it's essential that we improve it. It is really difficult to take these worlds of sort of knowledge generation and these worlds of value application and try to get them to talk to each other in the same plane of analysis. So I do think that science by itself isn't going to solve these problems, as if the legal system is just going to sit back and say, oh, okay, let's just sort of mix that in a glass of water and that's the solution. But what I do think is that the science can be really helpful for gradually shifting a ship of judicial system that turns very slowly. Now, sometimes we're glad it turns very slowly, so it's not faddish. On the other hand, it can be frustrating to scientists, I think, as in the case of eyewitness identification, and all the evidence that suggests scientifically that that's a really problematic area that the law tends to over-rely on. But I think that the better funded studies that continue to press on these social problems in ways that we know society and law cares about really do matter. But to matter optimally, They really have to force the integration of their hard and abrasive edges across various scientific disciplines. Because what the legal system doesn't want to see is the behavioral geneticists say this, and the psychiatrists say this, and the radiologists say this, and the academic experimental fMRI guys say this. That really frustrates the legal system because then they just don't know to whom to turn for expert advice.
And they have to make decisions anyway in
Exactly
the case
right.
of uncertainty.
They can't wait.
Right. Thank you. Let's say another question from this side. Yes, sir.
Larry Green from Denver, another city no stranger to community violence. What can any of you tell us about brain disorders, drugs, psychopathy, and the legal system when the violence of suicide and the violence of homicide unite?
Any of you want to tackle that?
I've got no direct data that can help you on that one. Or know of direct data that can help you on that one. I mean, it's an issue, but I can't help, unfortunately.
I think that when people kill others, especially in emotional situations that are related to family, etc., they know the consequences. You know, many of them know the consequences, and that might facilitate them killing themselves, perhaps.
I don't know how to answer it from the point of view of brain science. Looking at it just epidemiologically, you know, I was kind of surprised to come to see a description. There are a number of these sort of descriptions of mass shooters who then turn a firearm on themselves, school shootings and so on. And you get this description of troubled young men who are isolated, sometimes angry, delusional, sometimes preoccupied with weapons, and have this idea that by killing other people, they can become this sort of notorious anti-hero, and then many times turn the violent act inward and also kills himself. It's very, very difficult, again, to talk in causal terms about that because it matches the description of probably tens of thousands of other people who don't end up doing that. But it's something I think that really requires a lot more thought. I do know that mental illness, in terms of mental health interventions, are far more related causally to suicide than they are homicide, and that people who commit suicide, who survive a suicide attempt, they're unlikely to go on and die from another suicide attempt. So it's an opportunity to intervene in that sense. The confluence of those are you know, two different I think public health problems that intersect in a complex way. Thank you for your question. Let's take another one over on this side.
Hello, Lisa DeAngelis from New York. As a neurologist who cares for people with brain tumors almost exclusively, we have a very large cohort of patients that we follow, and I'm not aware of a single violent act committed by these patients. It's bothersome to me that we automatically ascribe violent behavior to structural lesions that are found on any kind of neuroimaging of an individual. Neuroimaging in this country is very widespread and prominent. We have incidental findings all of the time, some of which are quite dramatic, including large subarachnoid cysts, which are really asymptomatic. So these individual cases that become very prominent legal cases, I think sometimes divert our attention from the more fundamental brain science issues that should be addressing the violent behavior and not necessarily attributing them to the structural
Thanks
reasons.
very much for that comment. We just have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to need to start wrapping up, but would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I'll try to comment very briefly. I couldn't agree with you more, and indeed, nothing in what I said was intended to suggest that the legal system assumes here's a brain tumor, therefore he's not operationally functional. What I was suggesting is that there comes a size at which that inference becomes easier to make, relative to when it's smaller. And indeed, one of the things I was trying to highlight with the base rate problem is precisely this issue, that we have no idea how many people have these conditions undiagnosed. In fact, in our own research in neuroscience at Vanderbilt, one of our subjects who was on the faculty as a control group, we discovered a large mass in their brain, which seemed to have no effect on their ability to perform their job, so far as I know. But I agree with you completely that we don't want to make idle or casual assumptions that any brain condition has an automatic legal consequence. I couldn't agree with you more.
Take one more question from this side.
Yeah, Bill Vega from the University of Southern California. I'm sure you're aware that the attempt to predict dangerousness, for example, in general populations has poor predictive value. We've never been able to do it very successfully, and I think the burden of a focal explanation in biological mechanisms bears the problem of extending the explanation to explaining how these same traits become manifest versus relying on sort of a manifest or a latent explanation when you see in your other societies people who presumably would have these same traits at the same distribution have much lower levels of expression of manifest violence. So there has to be some understanding of how social cueing is operating to transfer that behavior from latent to manifest expression.
Thank you.
Can I just come up with?
Sure, please do.
I mean, I think that you're completely and utterly right. I mean, when I was talking about the neurobiology of instrumental aggression, the systems that give rise to we've got a system that is giving rise to impaired decision-making ability. That doesn't mean that a person is going to go and rush out and commit an offense. It just means that in a situation where they might be evaluating whether they should or should not, how on earth to achieve their goals, they'd be more likely to entertain a particular action that you say would not be prepared to entertain because you'd be representing the consequences far too adverse. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, when we're talking about the neurobiology, I mean, you heard it as well in Dr. Elia Klein's talk about the way that stress interacts to exacerbate the sort of hyperactive, emotionally labile, reactive aggression. In psychopathy, we're talking about environmental variables that are going to be more likely to motivate the individual to, there's limited other ways of achieving goals, and therefore more likely to entertain this one, and therefore, because they don't have the brakes so successfully, because they're not representing this decision-making appropriately, more likely to commit. So you're completely and utterly right. It's back to the same problem. From any individual biology, we cannot really predict unless we understand the person's interaction with their environment.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all of you for these very interesting comments, and I'd like to thank our panel, Professor Jones, Dr. Klein, and Dr. Blair. Thanks very much.
I would also like to add my thanks to the panel for a very stimulating discussion. We now get a chance to pivot from aggression to accolades, and I'm happy to invite Dr. Feinberg, although I wish he were wearing his turquoise bell bottoms, for the next session.